you. With that, we want to introduce retired Sergeant Dave Sprague. He was started the department in 2008. It did a variety of things throughout the department. Was a field officer, bike officer, was with our crisis negotiations team for quite a while. It was one of the primary negotiators. Was promoted and then has since retired from the department. So with that, I will turn the time over to you, Sarge.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Rosenbaum, I appreciate your presentation. You had some excellent visuals and analogies, I think, that kind of sum up a lot of, at least some of what I might talk about. And first, I'll apologize for a bit of a gravelly voice and occasional cough. I was down driving some dirt roads for a few days a couple of weeks ago down at White Sands Missile Range, and the roads have this very fine red dust that's almost like talcum powder, and breathing that in for a couple of days didn't do me much good. I just can't seem to clear it. But so first, a bit of my background. I'm an Albuquerque native. Went to school, graduated from the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque with a degree in engineering of all things. But I wasn't born a cop. I didn't have any family members that were in law enforcement. I've always had an interest in law enforcement, but I was the first one in the family, and becoming a police officer was really a second career, because I'd spent 27 years in the private sector in engineering and program management before making the leap. I needed to do something that was less stressful, so I decided to go through the academy and become a cop. So I was also a reserve officer with APD prior to going full-time when I was still working with Honeywell. So that was kind of my first exposure to law enforcement. So I kind of knew what I was getting into before I decided to go full-time. And like I mentioned, I worked in field services for 12 years with 1 year in operations. So most of my time was spent in the field taking calls for service. And I was on the crisis negotiation team for 6 years. And I'd have to say that I kind of view myself, since I wasn't, as I say, born a cop, that I was kind of an outsider looking in, I think. So maybe I brought a different perspective, or obtained a different view of police work than maybe somebody that starts at age 21 and really that's all they've ever known. So I'd have to say that my time with the department was enlightening. And I also say that unless someone has worked as a police officer, they can't fully appreciate and understand, I think, what police officers deal with on a daily and weekly basis. There's just no way that having lived kind of out in the sterile world for a long time, it was, again, enlightening and in some cases shocking what police officers have to deal with. And so I'd like to highlight a couple things that just observations or things that I noticed that I really didn't expect, or at least to the magnitude that I saw. One was just the number of people living out in society with severe mental illness, that some are basically functioning and others really aren't, but just the quantity of people out there that we would deal with. And in particular, one thing that I noticed just working day to day was that we tended to get like 3 to 4 on average calls for service for suicide attempts or suicide threat. And just checking, radio channels and what was going on around the area commands, it seemed to be pretty consistent with that rate of, say, 3 to 4 a day, regardless of what shift it was, day shift, swing shift, or graveyard. Didn't really matter what area command or what day of the week. It just seemed fairly consistent that and if you do the math, it comes out to about 1,600 calls a month, or 20,000 a year of 43-1, which is a suicide call of somebody threatening or attempting or successfully committing. So that was just one thing that I found pretty astounding, again, as an outsider coming in and seeing what police officers have to deal with and what was really going on out in society that people I don't think have a good knowledge or appreciation of. And I'll talk about my sister a little bit later on, but I've been touched by that myself. My older brother and my younger sister both, I lost them to suicide. So, if you watched Farrah Simmons' presentation in January, she also lost her son. And so it's something that can touch really anyone at any time. The other thing that was kind of new to me and a bit shocking was just the exposure to death. And it's not certainly exclusive to police officers. Paramedics, medical personnel in emergency rooms, they all deal with that as well. But it was kind of surprising to me is that the frequency with which officers have to deal with death. And it, you know, I had attended maybe a few funerals in my lifetime, but I hadn't really had any direct exposure to death previously joining the department. And it comes in different types of calls. There's just DOA calls, homicides, suicides, traffic fatalities. And a lot of officers just kind of accept it as that's part of the job. As Nils mentioned, some people have different ways of coping with it. Some just bury it and don't try not to think about it. Some people just grow numb to it. And every incident is different that a police officer responds to. And the particular circumstances of an incident may have a greater effect on some officers than others, maybe depending on what their past experiences have been. It could be the level of violence that you've encountered, whether a child was involved, watching someone die versus responding after the fact to someone that has died. And although it may not rise to the level of PTSD, there may be certain aspects of a certain incident that stick with you. It could be a certain sight, a sound, a smell. And as Nils mentioned, sometimes that can get buried in your subconscious, and then it may resurface based on, you know, some incident that you respond to at a later time. So as Nils mentioned, kind of the topic that we're going to talk about today is unexpected emotional reactions. So I was going to talk about a particular call that I responded to and kind of what happened after that. I was working the Northeast swing shift. This was in April of 2019. And I was en route to a priority 3 call, just kind of taking my time listening to the radio. And the alert tone goes off. And just as a side note, I always wondered if they did a psychological study about what frequency that alert tone should be, because after, you know, even 13 years on the department, that sound just raised the hair on my neck. It's just the right thing to get your attention, and it does. So the alert tone goes off. I knew that I was going to be the primary because I was the only one that wasn't on scene at a particular call at the moment. So I knew it was for me. Turn down my music radio so I could hear what the dispatch was going to be. So the dispatcher calls out my call sign. Says it's been a 27-8 shooting involving a child on Kelly Avenue. And so light her up, head that way. The call had come in from the child's father saying that something was wrong with their daughter. And then a second comment that it was a drive-by shooting. And so I arrived on scene, and I was the first one there. There was no indication that it was an active shooter or anything was currently going on. There was a woman standing on the front porch in front of the trailer, and the father had indicated that the babysitter had called him about what had happened, and it was a drive-by shooting. So I assumed that the woman on the porch was the babysitter. So I ran out of my car, decided to go in by myself because, again, it didn't seem to be an active scene at the time, and there were no other calls about shootings going on. So as I'm running up the stairs past the woman, I said, "What happened?" And she just said, "It was a drive-by." And she seemed upset, but not hysterical or anything. Just as a side note, it turns out that was actually the girl's mother, not the babysitter. So I run into the trailer, and I could hear in the back of the trailer a male voice, fairly hysterical, yelling something about his baby. And I go into the back room, and there's a man kneeling over a young as an 8-year-old girl on the floor next to the bed. And she had blood coming out of the side of her head. And I didn't see any gun, at least in the area. So I told him, to please try and pull the bed away so there's more room for us to work. And I grabbed her hand, and she was having difficulty breathing, kind of gasping for air. And I asked the man what her name was, and he said it was Diamond. And I called out on the radio immediately that it was a gunshot wound to the head of a young female victim, about 8 years old. And so the father did back away, so I was able to at least get close to the young girl. I knew that paramedics were on the way, but as you know, a minute can seem like an eternity, and it seemed like forever for the paramedics to get there. So I, tried to comfort her. She wasn't really conscious, but I did try to reassure her that everything was going to be okay. The paramedics were coming. And one dilemma that police officers sometimes face is when is it okay to lie? Say a narcotics detective that's doing an undercover operation, and he's asked, "Are you a cop?" The correct answer is, "Well, no, I'm not." Right? So obviously that's the correct time to say a white lie. But is it okay to tell someone that they're going to be okay when you know that they're not going to be? Because I could tell from the seriousness of the wound that this was very serious, that she probably wasn't going to make it. Now I'll come back to this, but I'll jump back in time 9 years prior to this. I was in the hospital room with my sister Margot, and they just removed the ventilator from her and the tubes that were keeping her alive. She had fallen into a depression, which was hard to understand because she was a professional. She was a registered nurse, very athletic. She was a triathlete, had won various regional awards for cyclocross and bicycle championships. And she was just the definition of fit, but she seemed to have a stable, happy marriage, a good job, but kind of fell into a very deep depression. And it got to the point where she would not want to come out of the house, wasn't taking care of herself, just liked to be in the dark with the blinds closed in the house. And ultimately she was taken over involuntarily to Caseman Hospital, mental health, as an inpatient. And the doctors had said that it was probably one of the worst cases of clinical depression that they'd ever seen. And she went through 2 different sessions of electroshock therapy. And it's really not what you envision or what the movies have presented it to be. They don't like strap people into a chair and electrocute them. It's done under general anesthesia, and electrodes are applied to certain portions of the brain to try and stimulate it. And in 2001, a study was done by the Journal of American Medical Association that 61% of patients treated with a combination of medication and ECT were in remission after 6 months. But unfortunately, my sister wasn't part of that 61%. She was part of the 39. And after her treatments, after a few weeks, they did release her because there seemed to be some good progress. And she was even able to attend my son's wedding. And my layman's assessment in interacting with her was that she was back up probably about 80%, I'd say. She was smiling, actually interacting with people, so that was a good sign. Then a few months later, I was at home. It was Father's Day, just celebrating with the family, having a barbecue. And I get a call from Kent Parsons, who, by the way, was kind of my mentor when I was a reserve officer, and he was working Foothills at the time. And he said, "Dave, you need to get up to your sister's house right away." And what happened was that her husband had gone for a bike ride, and he returned back home and found her hanging in the garage. And she went to the hospital and was put on life support for several days, but there was no brain activity. When they removed the life support, I was the only one in the room besides a couple of the medical personnel. And one of the things that stuck with me was just it wasn't peaceful as they show on movies and TV shows, that there's kind of a gasping and lurching of her trying to kind of the last attempt of the brain to save the body, I guess is what the doctor said. But one of the unpleasant realities of being a police officer is that at some point there's a likelihood that you're going to see somebody die. And my first year on the department working Northwest, I was at 3 officer-involved shootings, one of them my own, and was present watching individuals go through that same motion. Some people call it the death throttle. Just the gasping for breath. And that was kind of the same thing that I had seen when I was with Diamond in that back bedroom. So it kind of brought back that experience with my sister in the hospital. So the paramedics finally came, and the trailer was kind of cluttered and dirty, and there was no room to get a gurney into the back. So one of the big, strong firemen just scooped Diamond up into his arms and ran her out into the fire department rescue unit, took her off to the hospital. There were a lot of unanswered questions after that call. It was kind of strange that things just weren't adding up. The timeline didn't make sense. That the father had claimed that he called 911 after the babysitter had called him, and they were all the way across town over by the airport. But it would have taken him, even driving 80 miles an hour, probably would have taken him 20 or 25 minutes to get to the house. But he was already on scene when I got there, and I was there within 5 minutes after the call. So things just weren't adding up. So there were questions about why did they lie about where they were and what had happened. Where was the real babysitter? Where were the Diamond's 2 sisters that were apparently on scene during the incident? They weren't there when I arrived. So a lot of unanswered questions. Turns out it was not a drive-by. There were no shell casings outside. There were no bullet holes in the side of the trailer. They did ultimately locate the firearm that was involved in a dumpster and next to a neighbor's house next door. But to this day, I still don't know what came out of the final investigation, whether it was a suicide, whether one of the sisters was playing with a gun and it was an accident, or whether some other adult in the house was playing with a gun. But it was just a tragic, tragic case all around. So I've always been kind of the calm, cool, collected guy. When I worked for Honeywell, one of my supervisors said that I was like a duck, that always calm on the surface, but pedaling like hell underneath. And so I guess I kind of prided myself on that, it was kind of tough to get me ruffled. And another thing that I kind of prided myself was that I always tried to be prepared for anything. That I was never a Boy Scout, but when anyone need anything out in the field, call Dave. If you need batteries, he's got them. If you need a drug test kit, he's got it. If you lock your keys in the car, kind of the word on the street was, don't put it over the radio. That's embarrassing. Just call Sprague. He's got a lockout kit. He'll get your keys for you. So as is current protocol in any critical incident, there was a critical incident debrief, which was voluntary, and I did go to it. And they went around the room, for people just to tell what their feelings were, their thoughts about that particular call involving Diamond. And, I figured when they got to me, I would just be able to stoically give a brief accounting of the call, and that would be about it. But when it came my turn, it was very strange, kind of like Nils had talked about the dam breaking. It was completely unexpected that I just started to well up. I could barely breathe. I couldn't talk. And my only response was to say, I didn't expect the worst. And didn't abide by what I tried to teach my recruits when I was an FTO, was prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. And just I hadn't mentally prepared for the worst on that call, that I was hoping that, well, maybe it was just a grazed wound, or maybe she got shot in the foot. And so what I walked into, I just hadn't prepared for. And during the critical incident stress debriefing, it just kind of all came out, and it was completely unexpected. But it was a good release, though. There's no telling what would have happened if that dam didn't break and it was still suppressed. That what would have been the effect maybe later on. So there are different ways, again, that people deal with critical incidents or things that you've been exposed to. And I think that just and maybe Nils can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but just to me, the act of hearing my voice and talking about it out loud was very helpful. And I think that's what helped to kind of release those feelings at the time. Other things that can help are, they call it autobiographical journaling, and basically writing about the experience, which I've kind of done as well. That I basically wrote a story about my sister Margot and the incident involving Diamond, and kind of the connection that I made between the two, and that's helped me as well. Nils also mentioned things about exercise, which I think is important. Engaging with friends, especially maintain friends and activities outside of police work. I think that's extremely important to try and connect with what I call the normal world. And to be supportive and helpful to your squad mates and your friends within the department, especially if you see them going through a critical incident. That's extremely important, to be there for them. And then also to take advantage of the services that are offered with the behavioral health section, and especially the peer support program, which I think is critical. One note, and I think it's sad and it's very concerning, is that the life expectancy of a cop is 59 years, as opposed to the life expectancy of a normal civilian is 78.5 years. I mean, that's a huge difference, and I think that's a big problem. The rates of PTSD and depression among police officers is 5 times higher than that of the general population. And police officers are at a higher risk of suicide than the general population, which I think there have been several SCION presentations in the past about that. One thing I find interesting, the state of Alabama has found the peer support is so important that they've actually codified it into state law. They have an organization called the Alabama Law Enforcement Alliance for Peer Support that is led by a Dr. Tim Falk. And it's for peer support for not only police officers, but paramedics, fire department personnel. And it defines the requirements and training for peer support volunteers, and also the requirements for communication and confidentiality. So it's good that both APD and Albuquerque and other states have recognized the importance of peer support and how important that can be. But, I think for the moment, that's about all I had to talk about. If anyone has any comments or questions, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Awesome. We'll open it up. If you want, you can write your comment or your question in the chat, or you can unmute. And I will go ahead and facilitate all of that. One thing that you did mention, though, Dave, was how calm and mature you always were. That's definitely one thing I know. When I was the young kid in the squad, I would always look to you and think, man, he just knows everything and he knows what to do at all times. And I always loved and was looked up to you when you were around and when you were working.
Thank you.
But when one of the things that you were talking about with dealing with this repression and things like that is the journaling. How often do you journal? Do you do it every day, or do you just do it when the emotions kind of flood in?
I'd say maybe a few hours a week. There's nothing in particular that kind of drives me to do it other than I've got some spare time. Again, I've always intended to kind of write a book about my experience in law enforcement. And my first idea was I used to capture screenshots of CADs because you see the nuttiest stuff. And my original intent was to have different categories of the book that would be things like scary calls, stupid calls.
Yes.
But it turned out that probably 90% of what I'd captured were all stupid calls. So I was thinking I can't have a book that's got 90% of one chapter on one topic. So gonna spread it around to do some different things, like maybe talk about some of my other experiences on different things.
Nice. Nice.
Dave, for everyone that can't see me, this is Melissa Schultz. I wanted to say thank you for coming on.
Sure.
And on a personal note, you know, we were in ops together when I first came on to the department, and you were just so extraordinarily kind to me and helping me to get acclimated to the department. And in doing random things like you helped me learn the TIN code and, you know, all of that, and told me about the calls. And I really do appreciate that, because I don't think I would have stayed in this career without officers like you helping me to feel welcome and to learn all of those things. So thank you. But in your experience coming from a separate career to this, is this, I guess, I don't know if it's, would you encourage others to do that? Or would you, if you could go back and do it again, would you still do it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I never look back. I have no regrets. You know, I left $130,000 a year salary to make $18 or $18 an hour in the academy. And
this was in 2008, so
Yeah.
we got to adjust for inflation
Exactly.
and all of that.
but I absolutely have no regrets. That it's been a great time, and I learned a lot.
Well, I think we've been very lucky to have you. So
Well, thank you.
I'm glad that you came over.
Chief Eden said, thank you for your service and sharing your life experiences with us. You continue to be an inspiration. And then Lieutenant Gonzalez stated, very powerful, and thank you for your bravery. Are there any other comments or questions for Dave?
I just want to also say thank you so much for coming here and presenting. That's, I'm sure, never easy to talk about, even if you have talked about it before and many times. It's just always hard, and it's appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Shannon Miro just wrote, thank you, Dave. And most kid death calls will haunt us. And thank you for sharing. But yes.
I have one more question in the interim. When, how do you suggest that perhaps people, well, you said journaling, but deal with like the feeling of not knowing the outcome of the call, or having resolution to it? Because I hear this a lot, especially from our communications staff.
That's a very good question. And I was actually intended on bringing that up.
Oh, okay.
If I had a recommendation for the department, I know that detectives are extremely busy, especially homicide. It's just, it's nuts. It's crazy. But for the benefit of field officers, I think it is important at some point for if a case is transferred over to a detective, is that they go back and maybe do a rebrief to let them know the outcome or what happened, because officers do care. I mean, it's field officers are kind of the I don't know, the triage, right? That they take the initial call, do a report, and then move on to the next one. But if it's an important or critical call, I think they really do care and they want to know what the outcome was, and it can be helpful for them to know what that was. And if detectives can make it a point to try and do that, I think it'd be greatly appreciated.
That would be huge.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the same thing from our communications staff, that unless they feel a connection with one of the officers on scene, they don't feel comfortable asking later
Right.
for someone to update them on what happened. But the same thing, you know, there are calls that they are unresolved for them and they would like an answer to.
Yeah.
So I always try and encourage them to reach out and try and get an answer on what happened. So I think it'd be helpful for all of the
I'm
staff.
glad you asked that question, because I think that is important.
And then one last question for me, Dave, is I know you were in peer support and you were a big part of that. As someone that was in peer support, and then kind of your reaction in the debrief, how would you recommend looking or trying to find if that is going to occur, and how would you approach talking to that individual on, like, are they doing okay? What help can you help them with? You don't want to just like run and just give them resources and just listen, but how would you go about that? Does that make sense? Was that a rambled up question, but.
So how should somebody that's a peer support person approach somebody that may need some assistance?
Yeah.
Well, obviously you can't force it, right? That it has to be voluntary, but I think just making yourself available and letting them know that maybe talking through that sometimes just talking to someone on the side, and again, hearing your own words and hearing it out loud can be helpful, which might open them up to talk about it.
Definitely.
And I think doing things like this, the officers' ability or willingness to come and talk about these calls at least opens it up, hopefully, for others to feel comfortable speaking to someone.
Feeling the emotion. It's silly, but listening to the stories and feeling the emotion is completely different than listening to the story as a tactical version, and it brings more meaning to it, I feel like.
Well, everyone knows that, you know, officers pay a lot of attention, at least most of them, to their physical fitness. You know, they lift weights at the gyms and the substations or whatever, go to another gym, or they run or they ride bikes, but there's very little attention to the mental health aspect of police work. And that's as important, or maybe even more important, because the mental health, someone's mental health can directly affect their physical health as well. So I think there needs to be more openness and discussion about the need, and to destigmatize when someone needs some mental health support.
Well, one last call for anyone that has any comments or questions for Dave before we close up for the day.
Yeah, this is Fred Maurer.
Hi, Fred.
I've been doing this a long time, and Dave, I know we have run across each other, but I want to thank you, but I want to thank the doctor. I want to thank all of you. This has come so far from back in the day when we started peer support, trying to help officers involved, still involved in representing officers at shootings. I see it firsthand, and I can't thank you all enough for everything that you're trying to do, because it is such a critical aspect of helping deal with this issue that, as has been said, a lot of people just do not comprehend what you guys go through every day. It's just craziness, and I just want to thank you all for everything you've done, because we've come miles from trying to start a peer support group on our own. And Doc, thank you. And I urge everybody to keep pushing because we do owe such an obligation to officers like Dave who've given their lives in service to help us all so that we can eat a hamburger someplace. So it's just, people don't appreciate it, and I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Fred. With that, my email is in the chat. If you guys have any comments or questions that you do want to send to Dave, you can send them to me and I will forward them off to Dave so that way they can get answered and addressed that way. With that, we will be back in April. We're working on some speakers right now. We're getting in contact with some people, so keep an eye out on the flyer for that. It'll be on the GoScion.org page website. It'll be on the GoScion Facebook page as well as the Instagram. If you haven't liked us over there, go ahead and like us. I'm going to throw it out there. I'm going to be that